Focus on Ports, brought to you by Transnet National Ports Authority.
On this episode of Focus on Ports, Africa's trade industry is on the rise. Highlights from the 2013 Africa Ports Evolution Forum and insights from Norton Rose Fulbright on overcoming the challenges faced in Africa's ports. Welcome, I'm Arabile Kumete. Once again, growth projections for the continent remain positive. Africa's economy is set to grow by 4.8% in 2013 and 5.3% in 2014. Keep in mind, the global average is 4%. Brian Booker from ValueWalk.com sums it up nicely. With the rest of the world fighting back stagnation and recession, Africa has surged ahead as the global leader in growth. Even powerhouse economies in Asia, including Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, have been struggling amid global conditions. But over a third of African countries are enjoying growth rates in excess of 6%. This certainly is good news for Africa's trade industry. Although still under construction, business has been booming. The CNBC Africa team recently chatted to Leon Bezuidenhout, who is Senior Manager at Deloitte Corporate Finance. He gave us his insights into the continent's impressive progression.
Despite Africa's positive growth, the continent is constantly under fire for its shortcomings: lack of infrastructure, lack of resources, lack of skills. The advancement of technology has led to the global mentality of instant gratification, needing things to happen before you ask. A developing nation, as a work in progress by nature, cannot work that way.
African continent is actually almost resultant from colonial legacy, which has meant that there wasn't a focus on inter-Africa trade, essentially. It was around getting goods from inland to the coast. And so that has meant that the networks within Africa are constrained or non-existent in some instances. And it's actually been said that around 10% of Africa's trade takes place within overall trade takes place within African continents or between the different countries. Whereas if we compare that then to, for example, America, that stat sits at around 40% and Europe at around 60%. So inter-Africa trade sits far behind the international norms, and this is as a result particularly of the lack of infrastructure connecting the various countries within Africa.
Although the lack of infrastructure is on every agenda when it comes to doing business in Africa, Bezuidenhout says that it's not the major issue.
Perhaps the biggest challenge facing the freight industry is not necessarily the lack of infrastructure itself, but one of the biggest challenges is around the number of borders and border posts that are facing countries or companies trying to do trade within Africa. If we look at, again, the colonial history of Africa, we sit now with 53 countries with many border posts and many borders that need to be crossed. Now, the freight industry often now experiences delays at these border posts, and this also then means additional costs. So the cost of doing business and trade throughout Africa is obviously much higher than it would be elsewhere in the world. It's said that the lack of infrastructure in the ports, rail and port networks actually mean an additional cost of around 30 to 40% on top of what it would normally be elsewhere in the world.
With 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies residing in Africa, clearly there's an interest in investment regardless of the concerns. What might be a challenge for some is an opportunity for others.
I think the biggest need is around political policy and fiscal stability. So because these are long-term projects, the investors who are looking to fund infrastructure projects are looking at a long-term horizon. So they need to know that what has been promised to them with regard to taxes or agreements, opportunities like this are actually going to remain the same over that long-term horizon. They're not going to change over that course. Because if there's going to be changes, then obviously they're going to be lacking stability, and they wouldn't necessarily be as inclined to invest if the stability is not there.
Now, on the show, we've discussed ports such as the Port of Mombasa and the Port of Lagos, where congestion has caused detrimental effects. We are seeing more and more public-private partnerships in the sector to alleviate such issues.
A lot of the times the port's problems are relating to not necessarily the port operations themselves, but quite clearly also the linkages thereafter once the goods are on land or arriving at the ports to get out. So again, it comes back to the rail linkages and the road networks linking up to the ports so that these blockages and backlogs can obviously be rectified. But it also comes down to ensuring that the port personnel, the staff and that kind of thing are suitably trained, adequately provided with the resources they need to be able to do their job to the best of their ability. And Transnet is currently involved in skills transfer with Mozambican ports, and this will obviously assist in sharing their knowledge and what they've gained operating the South African ports with the neighbouring countries like Mozambique.
Transnet's 300 billion rand capital expenditure program kicked off just over a year ago. With just 6 years left to meet the market demand strategy deadlines, Bezuidenhout updates us on the parastatal's progress.
Transnet's actually come a fair way. They're obviously in their first year of this expansion program, but they did spend about 27 billion rand last year on their capital expansion program. Clearly this is just a dent in the 300 billion rand budget, but it clearly shows that they are making inroads into that expansion program. And if we look, just yesterday they announced that they had an issuance of a 1.5 billion rand bond, which follows on from a bond of 3.3 which they raised in June. Now, both of these bond issuances were actually oversubscribed, which shows that the investor confidence is there, and clearly the funding is available for them to be able to actually roll out this infrastructure plan. So if all goes well over the next 6 years, the remainder of their expansion plan, they're going to drastically change the face of the logistics and transport network of South Africa, and clearly for the better. And we'll hopefully then see this flow through to increased economic growth in not only South Africa but in Africa.
The African Ports Evolution Forum recently took place in Cape Town. Over 300 participants from 20 countries gathered to discuss efficiencies and modernization solutions. Let's take a look at some of the highlights.
One advantage of gathering experts from ports across the world is gaining an understanding of how Africa's ports compare with those in other countries. One would think that Africa's port systems lag behind those in Europe. Ton Bestenbrouwer has been involved in container terminal operations since 1980 in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He moved to Transnet port terminals in 1994, bringing to South Africa the knowledge he gained from the largest port in Europe.
In those days, let's say 1994, it was totally different from now. Yeah, but nevertheless, I found the same type of people, the same approach, the same problems as we had in Rotterdam. Although in those days in Rotterdam, no doubt, the infrastructure, the equipment, the systems were superior to what we had in South Africa. But the people were the same. And I used to say, my crane driver in South Africa is just as efficient as my crane driver in Rotterdam. The only thing that might differ is that the crane driver in South Africa hasn't got the facilities as in Rotterdam, and that definitely impacts on his performance. But he's skilled in the same way as the man in Rotterdam.
The African Ports Evolution Forum is not just about discussing issues, but also resolving them. Marco Plame is a senior port specialist at American engineering firm Bechtel. The company unveiled an innovation at the conference to meet the shipping challenges faced in Africa.
The fact that we are here is mainly for introducing a new port concept, port development, which is focusing on better utilization of the possibilities for port development in Africa, especially for the dry bulk industry, so for the mining. But there are also possibilities to do that for containers. So we call it a multi-user offshore hub.
They are in the process of identifying suitable sites for the project in East and West Africa.
How it works is that instead of bringing the big vessels to the shoreline and have to dredge deep channels to the shore, which is very costly, we build these structures or artificial islands. It depends on the utilization. So either it's for containers, then we're going to build artificial islands. When it's for dry bulk, we will build offshore structures, and we build them at the required water depth. So you don't need to dredge, and instead you're bringing the cargo out with barges. So you're using smaller ships sailing from more shallow ports along the coast to an assembly point, a multi-user hub offshore. And especially in those conditions where there's also the possibility for inland water transport using the rivers, so barging on the rivers, this is a very advantageous system and very profitable. And we worked out a case for Mozambique where the overall construction cost of the whole facility can go down with 40%, and the operational cost can go down with 60%. So that's really substantial, and we think that's a good message, and that's why we're here at the conference.
The innovation in this form does not exist anywhere else in the world. Plaim said that Bechtel has committed to improving shipping infrastructure in Africa. The company has operated here for over 70 years.
The concept I'm going to discuss this afternoon, the multi-user offshore hub, indeed will create much more jobs for the future, because it makes it possible that projects really come into fruition instead of getting stalled because they're too expensive. So by better utilization of existing transport corridors or inland water transport integrating with the system and building a port offshore instead of building several ports along the coast, we believe that in the end the number of jobs generated and the quality of the result is much better than the traditional solutions.
Transport systems on the continent has certainly changed for the better, despite growing challenges. In fact, the growing challenges is testament to the growing demand. The bulk of Transnet's 300 billion rand capital expenditure is dedicated to improving the rail systems. There seemed to be a consensus among participants at the forum that in terms of equipment, infrastructure and skills, the ports on the continent are among the most efficient in the world.
Confining myself to South Africa and seeing, and we heard the presentation of Tamorwe about what is going to be done in the container terminals and in the ports, but mainly in the container terminals. There's nothing wrong with the equipment. We've got state-of-the-art equipment. We don't have to be ashamed for our equipment, on the contrary. Our systems, IT systems, are state-of-the-art. Yeah? So it's a matter of economic growth, yeah? And that brings the volume, and that will show that the container terminals can do the job.
The challenges are the same as everywhere in the world, so you need to understand your clients, you need to deal with local customs and habits. I work in Africa already for basically all my life, so there are very few surprises. And as a company, I think we are well equipped, having worked all over the world. We work on all continents. Each challenge is its own challenge, but we haven't seen any specialties here in Africa that we really had to adapt.
More from Africa's port experts right after the short break. Stay tuned.